Today, France goes Orwellian, Canada goes Orwellian, and the UK goes Orwellian. There's clearly a pattern here. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Welcome to Liberties Report. In the past week, Canada, France and the UK have all taken strides towards the Orwellian. Canada approved Bill C-51, that's Charlie 5-1, which introduces many new crimes, which are restrictions on free speech, and which give increased powers to various enforcement agencies. And in the context of Bill C-51, security of Canada is redefined to also mean the economic or financial stability of Canada. Just like we've seen with previous bills, that can be stretched as if you're threatening national security, you can actually do that just by launching a disruptive startup, seeing how that threatens the financial stability of the nation's industry. And obviously it goes further. The threat to security here can mean anything conceivable, and there are free speech restrictions in place that make it a crime to advocate or promote terrorism in Canada. And we've seen before how terrorism is now anything the government doesn't like. We've seen peaceful protests be redefined as terrorism. We've seen how startups can be redefined as terrorism if they are challenging a powerful enough incumbent. So, with this bill in Canada, C-51, we're essentially seeing the government take itself, well, more or less the equivalent of martial law, only it's not worded like that. They are taking themselves the power to use any force against anything they do not like, up to and including peaceful protests. Fact is, yesterday, the government was already threatening groups that merely advocate boycott of Israeli goods with prosecution under this new law. Mind you, that is a group saying that don't buy goods and services from this country because we do not want to fund their government. And that was threatened with prosecution. That is how far-reaching it goes. Not that Canada is unique in that regard, but Canada has been kind of unique in the other way, that we've actually seen quite a bit of common sense and respect for liberties out of Canada. It seems that's unfortunately on the way out. France, meanwhile, is passing a similar law. Most of the news of this law is in French, but it is clear that the new law is legalizing bulk, warrantless metadata collection. We've seen that before, obviously. We've seen it in the US Patriot Act, specifically the infamous Section 215, which the NSA is currently claiming to legalize its dragnet collection of everybody's phone calls, but which the NSA had done for decades before the Patriot Act came into effect, more specifically since the 1970s. And so, the NSA doesn't really care about the Patriot Act. It's just the excuse du jour to do what they have always done. And this law in France, paradoxically and ironically and sadly, this law in France, which heightens security, as it's called, when liberties are being eroded, is justified by the attack on Charlie Hebdo's offices, the satiric press, where a terror attack killed many cartoonists. It's interesting to note that Norway, meanwhile, did the exact opposite, and, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attack, legalized blasphemy. That had evidently been a law on the books since way back when, and it was a reasonable and appropriate response to these attacks on blasphemy to legalize them entirely. Go Norway. Last but not least, we have the UK, which saw a general election, and where Tories got their own majority, Conservatives. No matter what you think about their economic policies, which you may or may not like, it is clear that they are definitely not in line with liberty. They've already announced a return of the so-called Snoopers Charter, which was defeated in the last term. They are talking about renouncing or de-ratifying the European Convention on Human Rights and replace it with an as yet unspecified UK Bill of Rights, which is quite alarming. Remember now that not even Russia is contemplating leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. If the UK even considers that, it's going to be a quite a landslide political move. So if you want to replace the European Convention on Human Rights with a UK Bill of Rights that doesn't at least contain the same rights, well, you are essentially abolishing a very important human rights document. And if you're replacing it with something that supersedes and improves on the European Convention on Human Rights, then why are you talking about replacing it in the first place? It's important to remember here that the UK goes way further than the NSA today. The UK listens to all content of every conversation, not just metadata, but actually the content. And the UK GCHQ stores all of it in rotating storage. Everything is wiretapped and stored. The UK is the Orwellian leader, if you can call it that, in the Western world today. It's also noteworthy that the NSA had a small setback in a court last week, but they are not going to care about that. There are only two ways to stop the NSA today. You cut electricity or you cut funding. Possibly you can also cut water for cooling to their server farm. I'm Rick Falkvinger and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.